Constantine was a pragmatic ruler, and Satan had long influenced the minds of such men. His ambition was boundless, his desire for control absolute. But Constantine was different from the emperors who had come before him. He was curious about this new faith that had spread across his empire, and he sought to understand its power. He knew that the Roman Empire was divided, politically, religiously, and culturally, and he was looking for a way to unify it. Satan saw an opportunity in Constantine. He whispered to him of the power he could wield if he aligned himself with Christianity. "Imagine an empire united under one faith," Satan said. "You can be the ruler not just of men, but of their hearts and souls. Use this faith to your advantage and the world will be yours." Constantine, ever the strategist, began to consider the idea. Then, on the eve of a crucial battle, he claimed to have seen a vision, a cross of light in the sky accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." Satan watched with interest as Constantine took this as a divine message and ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol on their shields. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge was a decisive victory for Constantine, and he credited his newfound faith for his success. From that moment on, Constantine embraced Christianity, and soon after he issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance throughout the Roman Empire. For the first time in history, Christianity was no longer a persecuted faith. It was now aligned with the power of the Roman state. Satan watched this transformation with a mixture of fascination and horror. Constantine's conversion was not an act of spiritual awakening, it was a calculated move to consolidate power. And yet, it had the unintended consequence of elevating Christianity to unprecedented heights. The very faith Satan had sought to crush was now the official religion of the most powerful empire in the world. But Satan was not without his cunning. He saw in Constantine's embrace of Christianity an opportunity to corrupt it from within. If he could not destroy the church through persecution, he would do so through power and influence. He whispered to Constantine and his successors, encouraging them to merge church and state, to blur the lines between spiritual authority and political ambition. The church, once a community of believers who followed the teachings of Jesus in simplicity and humility, now found itself entangled in the trappings of empire. Bishops and priests gained political power, and the church began to accumulate wealth and influence. Satan watched as corruption seeped into the institution, as leaders who once preached love and forgiveness now sought control and dominion. The faith that had once defied the empire now sat on its throne. Satan's plan was working. By aligning itself with the Roman Empire, the church was slowly losing its spiritual purity. Its leaders were more concerned with maintaining power than with following the teachings of Christ. The merging of church and state became a tool of control, a way to keep the masses in line. Satan knew that the more the church became like the empire, the further it would drift from its original purpose. But even as he reveled in this new form of corruption, Satan knew that the battle was far from over. Christianity was now too deeply rooted to be undone by simple corruption. The people's faith in Christ remained strong, even as their leaders faltered. Satan would need to dig deeper, to find new ways to weaken the faith that had defied him for so long. With Constantine's conversion, Satan's influence over the Roman Empire grew. The church had gained immense power, but it was a double-edged sword. As Christianity became the dominant religion of the empire, its leaders became embroiled in political intrigue, wealth and corruption. The faith that had once been centered on love and compassion was now used as a tool of control, and Satan watched with satisfaction as greed and ambition poisoned the church from within. But Satan was not content to stop there. The Roman Empire, weakened by internal strife and external threats, eventually crumbled. The collapse of the empire plunged Europe into what would later be known as the Dark Ages, a time of chaos, violence, and fear. The Church, now the most stable institution in a fractured world, stepped in to fill the power vacuum left by the fall of Rome. Satan saw in this new era an opportunity to tighten his grip on humanity. The Church, now entrenched in political and social life, became an instrument of control. Satan whispered to the Church's leaders, urging them to use their influence to maintain order through fear and obedience. He encouraged them to preach about hellfire, eternal damnation, and the wrath of God, reminding people that their only hope of salvation was through the Church. The message of Jesus' love and forgiveness was buried beneath layers of doctrine and dogma. The Church became a gatekeeper, controlling access to salvation. Those who defied its authority were branded as heretics, and Satan took great pleasure in watching as the flames of the Inquisition were lit. Torture, imprisonment, and execution became tools of the Church's power, and fear ruled the hearts of men. But even as Satan reveled in this newfound control, he knew that the darkness of the age was not just the result of human corruption. There was a spiritual darkness as well, a growing distance between humanity and the God they once loved. The people lived in fear, not just of the Church, but of the unknown forces that seemed to surround them. Superstition, ignorance, and violence reigned, and Satan thrived in this atmosphere of chaos and despair. He watched as kings and rulers aligned themselves with the Church, using religion as a tool to justify their wars and conquests. Satan whispered in their ears, encouraging them to wage holy wars in the name of God, knowing that in doing so they were betraying the very principles Jesus had taught. The Crusades, launched under the banner of reclaiming the Holy Land, became one of Satan's most successful manipulations. Thousands of men marched off to war, believing they were fighting for God, but in reality they were fighting for power, wealth, and glory. The blood of countless innocents was spilled, and Satan smiled as he watched the destruction unfold. The Church, once a symbol of hope and love, had now become an instrument of death and domination. But even as Satan seemed to hold sway over the world, he knew that his victory was not complete. The flame of faith still burned in the hearts of many. There were those who sought to return to the teachings of Jesus, who rejected the corruption and power-hungry nature of the institutional Church. These people, often marginalized and persecuted, held fast to their beliefs, and Satan knew that as long as they existed, his control would never be absolute. The Dark Ages were a time of great suffering, but they were also a time of resistance. Small pockets of faith remained, and despite Satan's efforts, the message of Jesus' love and salvation continued to spread, even if only in whispers. Satan understood that the darkness he had cast over the world could not last forever. Humanity would eventually rise from the ashes of this age, and when they did, they would be more dangerous than ever. The Inquisition was one of Satan's most brilliant manipulations, a period of history where the Church, in its pursuit of orthodoxy, became an agent of fear and oppression. What had once been a message of love and forgiveness had now turned into an institution that hunted its own followers, searching for heretics and dissenters, anyone who dared question the authority of the Church. And all of it, Satan mused, was done in the name of God. The very people who should have been spreading the message of Christ's grace were now inflicting unspeakable cruelty on those they deemed enemies of the faith. Satan had no need to create demons of his own. Humans were more than capable of becoming monsters when driven by fear, power, and zealotry. The Inquisition began as a way for the Church to root out heresy, but under Satan's subtle guidance, it grew into something much darker. Satan whispered into the ears of the inquisitors, encouraging them to see enemies everywhere. Fear became their weapon of choice, and soon even the most devout Christians lived in terror of being accused of heresy. Once accused, there was little hope of escape. Satan reveled in the hypocrisy. Those who claimed to be the guardians of God's truth had become the very thing Jesus had preached against: judgmental, power-hungry, and cruel. They burned people at the stake, tortured confessions out of the innocent, and spread fear throughout the land. And the people, desperate to avoid the wrath of the Inquisition, turned on each other, denouncing friends and family in the hopes of saving themselves. This atmosphere of paranoia was fertile ground for Satan's influence. He whispered lies into the ears of the inquisitors, convincing them that they were doing God's work, that every person they condemned was a step closer to purifying the church. He whispered fear into the hearts of the people, reminding them that one misstep, one wrong word, could lead to their death. The church, which should have been a sanctuary of peace and love, had become a place of dread. The trials were grotesque displays of power. Men and women were dragged before the inquisitors, their fates decided before the trials even began. They were tortured until they confessed to crimes they hadn't committed, accused of worshipping the devil, of practicing witchcraft, of questioning the authority of the church. And Satan, watching from the shadows, laughed at the irony. Here, in the heart of the church, people were being condemned for crimes they had never committed, while Satan himself remained free, untouched by their hatred. But there was a deeper game Satan was playing during the Inquisition. By turning the church into an instrument of terror, he was slowly eroding its spiritual authority. The more cruelty the church inflicted in God's name, the more people began to question its true nature. How could a church that claimed to represent a loving God burn its own followers alive? How could it justify torture, murder, and betrayal? As the centuries passed, the Inquisition became a symbol of the church's corruption. People began to rebel, not just against the church, but against the idea of religion itself. The seeds of doubt that Satan had planted during the Inquisition would bear fruit in the centuries to come, as more and more people began to reject the authority of the church and look elsewhere for meaning. Satan knew that the Inquisition was not just about controlling the present, it was about shaping the future. By turning the church into an agent of fear and oppression, he had created a generation of people who would question everything they had been taught. The Reformation, the Enlightenment, the rise of secularism, all of these movements had their roots in the horrors of the Inquisition. And Satan, ever the patient adversary, waited in the shadows, knowing that the seeds of rebellion had been sown. The world was changing and the power of the church was beginning to crumble. Satan had not won the war, but he had scored a significant victory. The Enlightenment dawned like a bright flame across Europe, marking the beginning of a new era in human history. It was a time of intellectual awakening, where reason, science, and individual freedom began to rise above the dogmas and superstitions that had held sway for centuries. For Satan, this period was a double-edged sword, both an opportunity and a threat. He had spent millennia whispering doubt into the hearts of humanity, encouraging them to question authority, but now those very questions were turning people away from God entirely. Satan had planted the seeds of rebellion during the Inquisition, knowing that the cruelty of the church would eventually cause people to turn away from it. Now, in the Enlightenment, those seeds were bearing fruit. Philosophers, scientists, and thinkers began to challenge the authority of both the church and the state, advocating for a world where reason and logic, not faith and fear, would guide human progress. Satan watched with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. On the one hand, the Enlightenment represented the ultimate triumph of free will. People were no longer content to accept what they were told. They wanted to understand the world for themselves. They sought knowledge, not from holy books, but from observation and experimentation. They rejected the idea that human beings were inherently sinful and in need of salvation, and instead argued that humanity had the potential for greatness through its own efforts. But there was something about the Enlightenment that made Satan uneasy. For the first time, he began to sense that humanity was moving beyond his influence. In their pursuit of knowledge and freedom, they were no longer merely rejecting God. They were seeking to transcend both divine and demonic control. The Enlightenment thinkers spoke of human dignity, of rights and liberties, of progress and enlightenment. They envisioned a world where human beings could create their own destiny, free from the shackles of both religion and superstition. Satan had always sought to liberate humanity from God's control, but now he realized that he had unleashed something far more powerful than he had anticipated. The Enlightenment thinkers were not just rebelling against God, they were rebelling against the very idea of spiritual authority. They no longer believed in the cosmic struggle between good and evil, they believed in themselves. Satan watched as philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau and Kant began to reshape the intellectual landscape. They questioned the legitimacy of the church's authority and championed the idea of separation between church and state. They called for the recognition of individual rights and the equality of all people. Science and reason, they argued, were the true paths to understanding the world, not religious dogma. In many ways, the Enlightenment represented everything Satan had fought for: freedom of thought, rejection of blind obedience, the pursuit of knowledge. But at the same time, it threatened to undermine his influence. Satan had thrived in a world where fear and doubt ruled, but now humanity was beginning to create a new world, one built on reason, not superstition. Satan's whispers of rebellion had helped spark the Enlightenment, but now he found himself in uncharted territory. He had always relied on humanity's darker impulses, greed, ambition, pride, but the Enlightenment thinkers were driven by ideals of justice, equality, and progress. Satan realized that he could no longer control humanity through fear alone. They had begun to seek something greater. Still, Satan was not without his influence. He saw opportunities in the Enlightenment's rejection of spiritual authority. He encouraged the spread of secularism, knowing that as people moved away from religion, they would become more vulnerable to other forms of control. He whispered to rulers and revolutionaries, fueling their ambition and lust for power. He knew that even in an age of reason, human nature remained susceptible to corruption. As the Enlightenment spread across Europe and into the New World, Satan watched as revolutions began to shake the foundations of old regimes. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, these were moments of profound change, where the ideals of the Enlightenment were put into action. But even in these moments of progress, Satan saw the potential for chaos. The reign of terror, the rise of dictators, the endless cycles of violence and power struggles, all of these were opportunities for him to exploit. Satan had sown the seeds of doubt during the Inquisition, and now, in the Enlightenment, those seeds had grown into something beyond his control. Humanity was beginning to chart its own course, free from the influences of both heaven and hell. But Satan, ever the cunning adversary, knew that even in the light of reason, the darkness of human nature could still be manipulated. The dawn of the Industrial Revolution marked a seismic shift in human history. Machines replaced hands, factories grew into sprawling hubs of production, and cities expanded into colossal urban centers. Humanity's reach stretched beyond what Satan could have ever imagined, and in this new age of progress he found fertile ground for manipulation. The Industrial Revolution was, at its core, a triumph of human ingenuity, and that was what both fascinated and disturbed Satan. On the surface, it seemed to represent the very freedom he had fought for, the freedom to create, to dominate, to rise above nature itself. But as the wheels of industry turned faster and faster, Satan saw how easily that freedom could turn to greed, exploitation and despair. He walked among the factories, the clanging of machinery echoing like the pounding of a dark heart. He saw men, women and children working endless hours in squalor and filth, their lives consumed by the relentless demand for more production, more wealth, more power. Satan whispered in the ears of the industrialists and factory owners, encouraging their insatiable desire for profit. "You can have it all," he whispered. "You control the future. All that matters is the bottom line." And they listened. In the booming cities of London, Manchester and New York, Satan saw a new kind of kingdom emerging, not built on divine authority, but on wealth and exploitation. The factories became temples to human ambition, and the factory owners became the new kings. They amassed fortunes that would have made the emperors of old envious, and they did so on the backs of the poor, who toiled away in conditions that broke both body and spirit. But Satan also saw the other side, the workers crushed by the weight of this new world. They had been promised progress, but they were living in misery. Their families starved, their children suffered, and they felt abandoned by both God and man. Satan whispered to them too, But his message was different. Revolt, he urged. Take what is yours. The world is unfair. Tear it down. The seeds of class warfare began to take root. Satan watched as resentment grew among the working class and as revolutions stirred in the hearts of men. The cry for justice rang out in the streets, but Satan knew that even the noblest of causes could be twisted into violence and destruction. He encouraged the rise of labor movements, knowing that where there was hope for change, there was also the potential for chaos. Strikes turned into riots and peaceful protests into bloody clashes. Yet for all the turmoil, Satan realized that something deeper was happening. The Industrial Revolution was changing the very fabric of human existence. People were no longer bound to the land, no longer tied to the rhythms of nature. They had built machines that could work faster, harder and longer than any human could. They had created cities that blotted out the sky, where the sun was seen only through the haze of smog. Humanity had gained control over the material world in ways that once seemed impossible, and with that control came the illusion of independence from the divine. Satan's whispers of rebellion against God were no longer needed. Humanity had already begun to distance itself from the idea of divine oversight. They no longer prayed for rain or harvest. They built machines to provide for their needs. They no longer looked to the heavens for signs. They looked to the smoke rising from their factories, the symbols of their own creation. Yet in their pursuit of progress, Satan saw their vulnerability. The workers were alienated from the fruits of their labor, and the owners were isolated in their ivory towers, blind to the suffering around them. Satan thrived in this growing disconnection, knowing that when people lost touch with each other, they lost touch with their own humanity. He whispered to the industrialists, fueling their greed, and to the workers, stoking their anger. He played both sides as he always had, knowing that the true power lay in sowing division. But Satan also marveled at how far humanity had come. They had harnessed the forces of nature, built machines that could outwork them, and reshaped the landscape itself. In their defiance of nature's limits, Satan saw echoes of his own rebellion against God. They were no longer content to live by the laws of nature. They sought to rewrite those laws. And in doing so, they were becoming gods in their own right, shaping the world to their will. But Satan, ever the observer, knew that this newfound power came at a cost. The air grew thick with pollution, the rivers ran black with waste, and the gap between the rich and the poor widened into a chasm. The very progress that humanity celebrated was also leading them down a path of destruction. And Satan, with a wry smile, understood that sometimes the greatest victories were the ones that humans handed him willingly. As the Industrial Revolution powered forward, the Age of Empires flourished. The great nations of Europe stretched their dominion across continents, colonizing lands and building vast empires that spanned the globe. Britain, France, Spain, Portugal and others carved up the world, claiming territories in Africa, Asia and the Americas, all under the guise of bringing civilization to the uncivilized. Satan watched as the map of the world was redrawn by imperial ambition, and in this age of conquest, he found fertile ground for his influence. He whispered to the rulers of Europe, playing on their sense of superiority and destiny. The world is yours for the taking, he told them. You are the chosen ones, destined to rule over the lesser peoples of the earth. Spread your power, claim what is rightfully yours. And so the empires expanded, driven by greed, nationalism, and the belief that they were bringing progress to the world. But Satan knew that beneath this veneer of nobility, there was a darker truth. The imperial powers did not seek to uplift the people they colonized. They sought to exploit them. The riches of Africa, Asia and the Americas flowed into the coffers of Europe, while the native peoples were enslaved, displaced and oppressed. Satan walked the lands of Africa, where entire cultures were uprooted and destroyed in the name of empire. He saw the blood spilled in the jungles of the Congo, where the Belgian King Leopold II turned the land into a personal fiefdom, extracting wealth through the brutal labor of the native people. Satan smiled as he whispered to the Europeans, feeding their delusions of superiority. This is your right, he told them. They are savages. You bring them civilization. The colonized people suffered under the weight of imperial rule. They were stripped of their land, their culture, and their dignity. Entire civilizations were erased, their histories rewritten by the victors. Satan delighted in the cruelty of it all, knowing that the empires were built on blood, lies, and exploitation. The same greed and ambition that had driven Lucifer's rebellion now fueled the conquests of men. But even as the empires grew, Satan saw the seeds of their downfall being planted. The arrogance of the imperial powers, their belief in their own invincibility, would eventually lead to their collapse. The colonies they ruled with iron fists would one day rise up in rebellion, demanding freedom from the very powers that had enslaved them. Satan whispered to the oppressed, fueling their anger, their desire for revenge. They have stolen from you, he told them. Now it's time to take it back.